A few weeks ago, the crew and I headed out to Sassoon Valley near Fairfield, California to talk with Abe Schoner, the mastermind behind the Scholium Project. When we arrived at the small winery, set in the middle of a small vineyard, there was a relaxed rural atmosphere with the distant hum of Highway 80 in the background. Abe allowed us to set up anywhere we wanted, so we chose the barrel room for our talk. Abe, great to see you again. And hi everybody, we're here with Abe Schoner, and he's the creator, professor of Scholium Project. We're here in Fairfield, California. And Abe, we've worked a little bit together, and we've known each other for a few years, and really I wanted to get to know you better and sort of talk about your project. And before we start into the wine stuff, I wanted to get a little background on you, because I've done some research also online, but really don't really know that much about your background prior to winemaking. So where are you from originally?
Well, that's hard to say in itself, but I can say this, that I came here from Annapolis, Maryland, where I had been a college professor for 10 years. And I came out here to learn a little bit about grapevine physiology, but without anything practical in mind at all. I was a professor at a liberal arts college and was really interested in what you might call the philosophy of plant biology, but without any intention of ever growing fruit or making wine from the fruit that I'd grown.
Because your background is in philosophy and classics.
I got a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy from the University of Toronto.
So I read that you started the Scholium Project kind of on a shoestring budget. From a business standpoint, can you explain how that process went and your first vintage?
Yeah, very much. I think it really is an interesting question, and I think back on the history of the project all the time. I started with almost no savings and no money to use as an investment. I was a college professor on sabbatical, and it was during the dot-com boom of the late 90s, and I was making a not bad but really not super special salary working for a dot-com in San Francisco. And I got interested enough in winemaking that I thought I wanted to buy a little bit of fruit, and I started really small. I started buying 1 or 2 tons at a time in each vintage, and maybe the cost of that fruit was only $1,000 or $2,000 a year, so a really small investment at first. And I spent 4 or 5 years making wine and was making some progress and getting better and better at it when I finally had to confront the necessity of bottling the wine. You can't just make it and study it in the cellar. At a certain point, it's going to spoil if you don't bottle it. And that's when you encounter real cost. Fruit is one thing, but labels and bottles are another. And I really had no idea where I was going to get the money to bottle the wine. And then I was so fortunate. An old colleague of mine from the beginning of the dot-com days had an independent project for me, and she wanted me to execute this very special self-contained thing for her. I think it took 3 or 4 months of my time, and that's where I got the money for bottling. And if that project hadn't come along, I don't know whether I ever would have put my first vintages of wine into bottle. So that's the origin of it. And I cobbled money together from various consulting projects. I started training myself in viticulture and had a few clients where I did consulting viticulture for them. Eventually I went to work for Luna Vineyards. I made a little bit of a salary from Luna, and I would divert as much of my money as I could from my consulting projects and from my salary to pay for starting my winemaking. So I did it with the benefit of this one consulting job and then just siphoning money out of my normal income.
And where did you make your first vintage?
I made, I think the first 3 vintages all at Luna Vineyards when I was working for them part-time in the cellar, as a harvest cellar worker, part-time as a consultant in viticulture, and eventually in 2002 I got the job as winemaker there, and I made my wine in the cellar while I was the winemaker at Luna in, if I recall correctly, 2002 and 2003, and then after harvest 2003, I moved everything to White Rock Vineyards, just right up the road in Napa. And then in 2006, I moved everything to Sassoon Valley, where I am now.
In regards to your wines, Abe, do you make your wines with an end goal in mind? And where do you see the process starting?
I would say we never make our wines with an end goal in mind. And for us, everything starts with finding a vineyard that we really want to work with. And then we take some kind of guess at what we can do that would allow us, not anybody, but just us, the way that we work, the way that we like to work, what would allow us to make the best possible wine from that vineyard. But it really is a kind of interaction between what we see going on in the vineyard and what we feel like we're good at. And so it wouldn't be fair to say we have no aim in mind, but I can tell you this: we never think, oh, we'd like to make the following kind of wine, let's go find a vineyard and then apply some techniques so we can make that wine. No, we go around looking for vineyards that seem challenging and seem like they've got the possibility for excellence, and then we try to figure out what we can do with those vineyards. And one of the interesting things is we don't even tend to ask whether it's red fruit or white fruit. We're so little interested in what the nature of the fruit is and so interested in what the nature of the vineyard is that we don't really ask what it is that we're going to make from it. We just want to work with the vineyard and see what we can do.
What attracts you to a vineyard?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that one of the things that's really important to us in any vineyard that we work with is the sense that the vineyard is on the edge of something. Either it's on the edge of recognized excellence, and maybe it's just a beautiful vineyard that absolutely takes care of itself, but it's in an area that is not well recognized, or maybe just the opposite. It's an area that's really well recognized, like Coombsville and Napa, but it's a vineyard where the vines are really old, the farming's been marginal, maybe the vineyard hasn't really been taken care of that well, and it's not clear how it can do. And then we look at a vineyard like that, and we can't resist the challenge of taking over the vineyard, seeing what we can do to improve the farming, and then seeing what kind of wine we can make from it.
Do you consider your wines natural wines, or do you go for a more traditional approach to winemaking?
I'm in the middle of, or I should say, not really in the middle, but I'm at the beginning of what I call a metaphysical lecture tour, where I go around, for the most part, the United States, but to some degree, cities in other countries, and I hold seminars on topics related to winemaking. And the topic that's at the center of everything that I'm doing right now is something like, what are natural wines? What is the nature of natural winemaking? What's the interest of natural wines in the marketplace? And how is it that natural wines are made? And one of the reasons I'm interested in that is because from the birth of this movement, Scholium Project wines have had a kind of odd role, because some of the wines really look like they're made in the same way that many of the wines are at the forefront of the movement are made, and some of the wines are not made that way at all. And so what I find is we're not dogmatic about what we do. We're not adherents to any particular movement. So some of the wines to other people look like they're natural wines, but to us they just look like it's part of our day-to-day activity. And we don't draw a distinction between wines we make in what you might call a natural mode as opposed to wines we make traditionally. We don't see that division. We might employ different techniques with different wines, but not so much because we're trying to be in one place or another, or not even because we're trying to apply particular results, but mostly because we think one set of practices will work better with one vineyard, another set of practices will work better with another vineyard, and we don't really care whether those practices come down as being traditional or natural.
And so that begs the question, so what is the relationship that you have with sulfur addition versus non-sulfur additions, or is that even something you consider?
We were shooting the shit in our little laboratory office that is so small that it only has a sink and 2 chairs in it before this interview started. And my really close colleague, Brenna Harrington, said that she's been learning a lot about SO2 from somebody she's been spending time with. And I was immediately resentful, thinking, how is it possible that after all the time we've spent working together, you could be learning more about SO2 from somebody else? And it's not because we use so much of it. There are many wines that we make, maybe even the majority of the wines that we make, that have no SO2 additions and no measurable SO2 at the end of the winemaking process. But nonetheless, we take the use of SO2 in the winery very, very seriously. And not seriously the way you take a loaded gun seriously. It's an interesting intellectual question for us and an interesting technical question for us. what you get from using SO2, what are the ways that SO2 works, what are the different things you can do either to avoid using it or in conjunction with using it. So we spend a lot of time thinking about SO2, even if we only use it, I would say at the moment, maybe in 2016, at most on a quarter of our wines, maybe fewer than that.
I did want to ask you a little bit more about the metaphysical lectures that you've been giving.
Yep.
And is that a really good way to connect with your consumers or potential? Is that important to connect?
It's a really good question. What I don't like doing is I don't like doing traditional tastings, and I pretty much refuse to set up a table somewhere and stand behind the table and pour wine for people because I don't get enough of a connection from that. It's not that I'm against pouring my wines, but it is so important for me to really feel like the person that I'm serving the wine to has even some small understanding of what we're doing. And for that reason, talking to them is really important. And big tastings where you're behind a table, you just don't really get a chance to converse with people. And what I realized was that after several years of doing these tastings that really seemed too superficial, that I needed to create a different kind of environment and a different kind of occasion if I wanted to have real conversations with people. And what I found, partly because of my background as a college teacher, is if I set up an environment that is in some way scholarly, academic, in some way like a classroom, and begin the whole thing with something that looks like a lecture, it looks like me talking to them, then pretty quickly it turns into a real conversation, which is the aim. The aim isn't to give a lecture, for sure not to talk to people about my wines in a way that doesn't go back and forth. The aim is to start something that will go back and forth.
Okay. And so that understanding for you is important for the customer then.
You know, on the one hand, I would never say that I think that the wines need something like an intellectual background so you can appreciate them. I want them to stand on their own as objects of deliciousness. But on the other hand, I think the whole thing that we're engaged in is so interesting that I want to share it.
Tell us a little bit about your adventures in Scandinavia and why you're marketing in the Scandinavian countries.
So I just got back from this thing that I call the Tour of the Northern Lands. Obviously,
Right.
You've paid a little bit of attention to it. And there are many reasons why I did this, but maybe the biggest reason is because about 2 years ago, I went to a really interesting small restaurant on the west coast of Norway where I felt like the way that people were working there was with a really high level of intensity, a high level of passion, a lot of precision. And I was so flattered that they brought me over there to be part of what they were doing. And I became, really enamored of this little culture in this small town on the west coast of Norway. And it stayed in the front of my mind. And then, for completely separate reasons, one of my best friends from San Francisco got a job working at the same restaurant as the wine director. And so I stayed close to her as she got involved in her job. And I thought, what I really want to do is I want to do something that brings me back to this restaurant, allows me to work closely with my friend who's now working there, but brings something special from California to Norway. So that was the kernel of it. And once she and I started working on this little project there, I thought, as long as I'm going over, why should it be a little thing that's limited? Why not turn it into something big? And so I thought, I'll start in London, where I already sell some wine. I'll go from London probably to Sweden or maybe to Norway, and from one country to another, go to Denmark. At first I even thought about going to Finland, but at a certain point you have to get everything under control. You can't go everywhere. And I was talking about this with a really close friend of mine, Alex Kongsgaard, the son of John Kongsgaard, who taught me how to make wine. I was talking to him about this at a party this winter, and I could see this look in his eyes that he would be interested in joining me. So I said, Alex, let's do this thing together. And then it became a joint project, which made it, 4 times as interesting.
If we were going to make a documentary about your life,
Yeah.
what bands would be a part of the soundtrack?
Bands, James Brown. The whole soundtrack could be James Brown.
Get up, get on up, get up, get on up.
What's your favorite sport?
Oh, NFL, no question. Yeah.
What do you eat for breakfast?
Coffee.
What do you do to relax?
Cook. I think cooking is really my main form of relaxation.
And what is something that you do only for yourself, to nurture yourself or
That's a really good question too. And it's really interesting. Right away, what I thought of as the answer to the question is cooking. And so it's interesting that cooking is something that I very much do for others, but I also can do it only for myself.
Thank you so much,
Oh,
Abe,
thank
for
you.
your
That was
time.
a pleasure.
Our interview with Abe was really interesting. He spoke of making wine from a theoretical perspective rather than having an end goal in mind. Abe, unlike anyone I know, chooses a vineyard not for its varietal, but based on its condition and possible potential. Although we were not offered any wine to taste during our interview, having tried some of his wines before, I can tell you that the wines are as unique as Abe's approach to making them. Abe is clearly working outside the parameters of normal wine producers and was a perfect candidate for outside the glass. You can find out more about Abe and Abe's wines at scholiumwines.com. Join us next time when we catch up with owner Jeffrey House of Ace Cidery in Sebastopol, California. And see you next time on Outside the Glass.